In our last episode, we studied the Gabrielino tribe who live in the area of present-day Los Angeles. One day in October of 1542, they saw something unusual. A group of ships unlike any they had ever seen. It was a small fleet commanded by Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, and it was the day their world was forever changed. In this episode, let us look at the life of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, whose life follows the Spanish conquest of the Americas. But already, we find the limits of our sources. Where was Cabrillo born, and when? Our sources are vague and contradictory. Some documents give his birthplace as Portugal, although no hometown is named. Other sources suggest he was Spanish. No source gives a birth date. He is called a Portuguese navigator by 17th century chronicler Antonio de Herrera y Tordesillas. Recently discovered documents from 1531 state a man named Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo was from a village in Spain. The names Juan and Rodriguez have Portuguese versions, but Cabrillo is never referred to by those names. The question is further confused because at the time, names were not always written consistently, and there would be many people with names like Juan Rodriguez. My main source for this video is Harry Kelsey's book titled, appropriately, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, published by the Huntington Library Press in San Marino, California. As far as I can tell, it is the only full-length biography of Cabrillo in English. Cabrillo's birth date has been speculated as being between 1490 and 1500. When he led the expedition to California in 1542, he was a wealthy man and was called the Admiral of the Fleet. His name is first mentioned in 1510, when he arrived in Hispaniola and began his career. If he was born around 1500, then he was probably a page or a servant. If he was born in the 1490s, perhaps he was a teenager. What was his family background? We can only speculate. If he was from the Spanish royal family, we would probably know more about him. But does that mean he was from a very poor family? Not necessarily. Kelsey believes the few surviving documents written by Cabrillo suggest he was well educated for the time. The 1510 event where Cabrillo enters history is the Spanish invasion of Cuba. Again, we don't know if he joined that expedition as a soldier or page, but the tactics used must have left an impression on the young Cabrillo. Bartolomeo de las Casas was a chaplain in the expedition who later recorded the events. When the Spanish landed, the first Indians they met were quite friendly and invited the newcomers to a feast in their village. While the Indians were noting the unusual dress of the visitors, one of the soldiers drew his sword and attacked an Indian. The rest of the soldiers drew their weapons and slaughtered the entire village, even the animals. What effect did this have on Cabrillo? He did not leave a memoir, and we have only a handful of documents in his own hand. Those that survive are official documents that do not express his personal views. There is certainly no record of him questioning these actions. In fact, he used the same brutal tactics throughout his career. 16th century Spain had only recently evicted Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula. That struggle may have reinforced the idea that against non-Christian and non-European enemies, any tactic is allowed. After Cuba was taken, Cabrillo seems to have gained shipbuilding skills, which would come into play later. He also engaged in commerce, which makes sense since the conquistadors were essentially private soldiers whose pay was whatever they could seize. They weren't explorers as much as plunderers. In 1519, Hernan Cortés led an expedition to the coast of Mexico, seeking new lands and wealth. He had permission from Governor Velázquez of the newly conquered territory of Cuba, on the condition that Velázquez would be the governor of any new territory as well. Cortés fought the Aztec Empire with a combined force of Spanish soldiers and Indian tribes who joined the Spanish cause. But then he enraged Velázquez by sending a message directly to Spain declaring himself governor of the newly conquered Aztec lands. An angry Governor Velázquez sent a force to arrest Cortés. The force was much larger than Cortés' army, so they probably expected no problems. By the time they caught up with the renegade, night was falling. Velázquez's forces, led by a rather inexperienced young nobleman, made camp for the night. Cortés and his men launched a surprise attack in the darkness, and he killed the opposing commanding officer. Cortés suggested to the survivors, "Why don't you all join me in looting the Aztecs? They have plenty of land, gold, and treasure. I mean, isn't that why we came here?" Cortés' former opponents reflected on their options and said sure. One of these survivors was Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. But there would be no reward for them unless they could take the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The city was built on a lake, and the Aztecs made it highly defensible by simply destroying the bridges from the lakeshore to the city. And here's where we learn an interesting fact about Cabrillo. As a shipbuilder, he was put in charge of a group of Indians and ordered to build boats for use in the assault of Tenochtitlan. There was plenty of wood to use for construction, but Cabrillo was missing a vital ingredient. He had been trained to waterproof the hull of the boats with a mixture of tree resin and animal fat. Tree resin was available from the local forest, but they had none of the cattle that were usually used for animal fat. Cabrillo improvised with a gruesome alternative: the fat cut from dead Indians. The chronicles state Cabrillo didn't murder anyone for this, since the extensive fighting meant plenty of Indian corpses were available. The entire story of Cortés' destruction of the Aztec Empire is beyond the scope of this video. Interested viewers are encouraged to study further.